Hi, everyone. I'm Meredith Walters from Brooklyn Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We love this partnership with the Public Theater, I hope you saw on December 3rd, we had Fear of Black Vengeance in Shakespeare. That if you missed it, it's available on the Public Theater's YouTube page and also on the BPL Presents Facebook page. We're here tonight and we'll be back again on December 17th. And it's just a pleasure to be a part of this Public Shakespeare Presents series. And I'd like to introduce you to Michael Sexton, who's the director of the Public Shakespeare Initiative.
Thanks, Meredith. Good evening and welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Sexton. I'm the director of the Public Shakespeare Initiative at the Public Theater, and it gives me great joy to be with you tonight. We're really pleased also to be collaborating with the Brooklyn Public Library and BPL Presents. So thank you, Meredith Walters, Jakob Orsos, and the whole team at BPL Presents. It really feels great. Before proceeding, I want to acknowledge the first inhabitants and caretakers of the land where the Public Theater, the Delacorte Theater, and Brooklyn Public Library's many branches stand, the land of present-day New York City and the unceded land of the Lenape and the Canarsie peoples. We at the Public Theater and Brooklyn Public Library acknowledge their painful history of genocide and forced removal, and we honor their ancestors and pay our respects to their continued and their emerging presence. It's a strange and powerful moment. Strange to feel like we're talking at the heart of change. It's a moment certainly unlike any I've lived through before. It feels stressful and uncertain to me, but full of promise as well. For us at the Public Theater, it's been a time of reflection and of self-examination, and it's a chance to look back, reflect on where we've been, and pause before we move forward, which we hope is soon. By taking an honest look and a questioning look at the legacy of the Public Theater, our relationship to the city and the communities we serve, and Shakespeare's role in all of that, we think that truths can be exposed, differences of experience and understanding can be shared, and a more meaningful, collaborative, and anti-racist future can be forged. And tonight's conversation, all of these conversations this fall, are part of that effort. During the course of the evening, please feel free to enter questions and comments into the Q&A button here if you're in the Zoom room with us, or on the live chat if you're watching one of the YouTube channels. And we'll be looking for those, and if we have a moment towards the end of the evening, we'll engage those questions more deeply. Thank you for your thoughts and contributions and presence. I'd like to introduce tonight's panelists. Issa Davis is an award-winning actor, writer, and songwriter working on stage and screen. She was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Drama for her play Bull Rusher, and wrote and starred in Angela's Mixtape, named the best play of the year by The New Yorker. Other plays include Ramp, The History of Light, Paper Armor, Girls, and Cirque du Soleil's first ice show, Crystal. Issa is currently at work on a musical version of Devil in a Blue Dress, and for TV, a limited series based on the memoir of Carlotta Walls Lanier, the youngest member of the Little Rock Nine. Stephen Greenblatt is Kogan Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University. He's the author of 14 books, including Tyrant, Shakespeare on Politics, The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, and Will in the World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare. He's the general editor of the Norton Anthology of English Literature and of the Norton Shakespeare. His honors include the 2016 Holberg Prize from the Norwegian Parliament, yay, Norwegian Parliament, and the 2012 Pulitzer Prize and the 2011 National Book Award for The Swerve. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History and Affiliate Professor of Law at Harvard University. She's also a staff writer at The New Yorker and host of the podcast, The Last Archive. I'm a big fan. You should listen. It's fabulous. Her many books include the international bestseller, These Truths, A History of the United States, which was named one of Time Magazine's top 10 nonfiction books of the decade. And her most recent book, If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future, has been longlisted for the National Book Award and shortlisted for the Financial Times McKinsey Book Award. Welcome, all of you, to the screen. Hi. So I'll just say the thing that inspired tonight's evening for me was some questions about Shakespeare and democracy in particular. But I wondered, is there anything in Shakespeare that points to or anticipates modern liberal democracy and the ideas of citizenship, the consent of the governed, and human rights, individual human rights that undergird it? Is there anything in those plays that speaks to that? I want to ask you now, does that seem like a crazy question? You know, considering who Shakespeare was, where he lived, and the, you know, the values that he was raised inside of. Stephen, maybe you can talk. Do you think it's a nutty question to try to draw links between the two?
Not exactly nutty, Michael, but it needs to be put in context. Shakespeare lived in a monarchical system. He knew absolutely nothing about the democracy that we enjoy. He would have been astonished by notions of rights, the rights of citizens, rather than the position of subjects, which he would have thought of himself. And having said that, it doesn't seem to me a nutty question at all, partly because Shakespeare became part of our inheritance in a very profound way and shaped lots of the ways in which we think about our political and social life. And because there are qualities in his imagination that allowed him to think outside the box of the monarchical system he knew that he lived in.
Great. Jill, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a nutty question. I think actually another way to think about it, though, is how much influence the objections of indigenous peoples and people being carried off into forced human bondage act as a catalyst for conversations about rights. And that goes back to the Spanish in the 16th century. So there is actually, while we're some decades before the English Revolution and that debate between king and parliament about rights and sovereignty, we're very much in Shakespeare's lifetime in a larger conversation coming from across the Atlantic of indigenous peoples insisting on their rights or protesting European colonization in language that Europeans come to understand as the language of rights.
Great. Isa, do you have any thoughts on that? Just Shakespeare and democracy?
I really think about theater, actually, in a broader sense, and less about Shakespeare, but the concept of theater as a possible democratic model. And I think specifically around Shakespeare, we talk so much about, the groundlings and how theater continues to be more accessible in London at that Old Globe Theatre, right, than it is here. And so I really love to think about the way in which theater, more than any other mode or medium for me, really allows a kind of vulnerability and compassion and a sense of connection. And I think, Shakespeare being the artist that he was, and able to unfurl all of the insights into humanity, I think that, there have been many, an epiphany that has happened in the course of watching a Shakespeare play or just in theater in general.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question that sort of is going to inform our conversation tonight is, what's the role of art and narrative art, storytelling in a modern democracy as well? We'll just let that one sit there for a second. Leading up to it, I was also struck by a passage in Federalist 51. It's one of James Madison's tracts, and he's describing the Constitution and the way it's arranged in order to involve competing interests, competing branches, and how the sort of the ambition of the individual legislatures or executives can serve to compete with each other and counteract and hence breed, well, a good government. Let's just hear a little bit from Federalist 51 from Isa, it'd be great.
Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary.
Fabulous. Yeah, I'm really struck in particular by that phrase in there. What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? And that is something that, of course, it struck me as once obvious, but I'd never sort of heard it that way before, that the job of designing a government must be a reflection on who we actually are as people, and also seemed like a thread that connects the Founding Fathers with Shakespeare. Jill, do you have how do you think government is a reflection on human nature?
I think that Madison absolutely thought about it that way, and I think we would do well to spend a moment on the word constitution. To constitute something is to make it, and we use it that way. But of course, Shakespeare used it to talk about the constitution of the body, the system of regulation of our body. You have a good constitution or a poor constitution. And the Constitution as an instrument of government, as a document that frames the government or the body of law that regulates the collective behavior, is very much entangled not only with reflections on human nature, but with the making of art. And this is, Rousseau said in 1762, the constitution of a man is the work of nature, but the constitution of a state is a work of art. And I think there's something of that in that passage from Federalist Papers, where Madison is recognizing that a constitution will regulate the body that is our body politic, but that regulation kind of depends on our constitution as a people, like who are we? So you have to have a kind of theory of human nature to figure out how to devise a constitution that will be just. So it's very much the one dependent on the other.
Stephen, do you think Shakespeare would have considered himself as someone or his writings, say, to be a sort of overtly a reflection of human nature? Yeah.
I'm confident of very little, Michael, but about that, I'm confident the answer is yes. You would have thought that, because he has Hamlet say this to the visiting troupe of players that come to Elsinore. Hamlet speaks of the purpose of playing, whose end, both at the first and now, was and is to hold, as it were, the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure, he says. That's about as good a description of the way plays can reflect human nature that I know of. And it is precisely when we represent our nature in plays or poems or in dreams, as what Aristotle called mimesis, that we as the viewers, as the readers, are able to see ourselves and to reflect on ourselves and what we are and where we might be going.
Isa, do you, as an actor and as a playwright, do you see that as part of the job, or is that that is to reflect or to represent people's nature?
I think that a lot of what I would do on the page, what I continue to do, is hopefully reflect. But I think that, if you look at the government and the arts, that of course they're both a reflection of human nature, but we're seeing all of human nature in both of them, right? We're seeing violence, egregious acts of self-interest, and we're seeing this transcendence, these dreams of altruism. And of course, where you are, right? Whether you're a subject, the monarch, that's going to inflect your experience of government and of art, right? So where I come from, my family and my people, I mean, we've had to fight the government for freedom, as Jill was speaking about, like the concept of rights, and often it comes in this sense of contention. And so what I think about our human nature is that it is infinite and always has to be shaped. You said mirror up to nature. And of course, I want to turn around and say the Bertolt Brecht quote, right, about art is not just a mirror held up to human nature. I'm going to change his words, reality to human nature, but a hammer with which to shape it. And I think shaping something doesn't mean you get to make it into exactly what you want it to be, but you try to affect it. And I think plays and poetry and art just provide blueprints for how we can shape our governing and our communities.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thanks. Thank you all. So we're 20 minutes in, let's talk about some Shakespeare. Let's hear some Shakespeare. We're going to spend the rest of the evening talking about Shakespeare and the ways his work touches on these questions of history, government, and human nature, as well as the role of arts and artists and storytellers in particular. Two quotes from Jill Lepore before we hear the first reading. I think they're both from the introduction to The Story of America. One is, history is the art of making an argument about the past by telling a story accountable to evidence. And I'm sorry, I thought I had it written down, but her second, I'll come back with her second one, which is around storytelling. Oh shoot, I'll get it back to me. But Stephen, I want to talk to you about storytelling. How does storytelling work in Shakespeare? Not for nations and for individuals, not just the story that he's telling us as an audience, but the stories that the characters and communities tell each other.
I mean, Shakespeare is obviously one of the greatest storytellers who has ever lived. But the key thing to say, I think, is that he never tells a story in his own voice. He tells his stories through the characters of others, through the voices of others, as if he believed that it was only through multiple voices, often conflicting, contradictory, contested, that the stories that actually matter, the stories that have some truth to them and some power to endure and to change us, as Isa just said, it's only that way that they can be told. And even these stories, he recognized, are always subject to change. That's the very nature of the theater, as he understood it, and of Shakespeare's theater above all. His contemporary, Ben Jonson, always wanted to freeze the plays exactly as Ben Jonson, wanted to tell them. That wasn't Shakespeare's way of going about his business. He understood that people were going to change them. The stories don't have stable meanings, and it's against their very nature to try to get back to some original essence. There's no originalism that's true to Shakespeare. Shakespeare welcomed the fact that his stories, which he mostly stole from others and then transformed, would in turn be changed, retold, stolen, reformed. That's what we're doing tonight. That's what we're always doing. And that's particularly what the living theater is doing.
Great. I found the quote. The other one is, all nations are places, but they are also acts of imagination. And this first reading, I think, is an illustration of the nation as an act of imagination. It's a reading from Henry V, Act 1, Scene 2. It's the Bishop of Canterbury, and it's early in the play where Henry V is getting his peers and the church behind the idea of invading France. And there's worry among the council that they won't be able to do two things at once. They won't be able to go abroad and fight the French and protect themselves from incursions from the Scots from the north. And the Bishop of Canterbury assures the king that England is capable of doing several things at once. And so let's hear from the Bishop of Canterbury as he urges Henry to go to war.
Therefore doth heaven divide the state of man in diverse functions, setting endeavor in continual motion, to which is fixed as an aim or but obedience. For so work the honeybees, creatures that by a rule in nature teach the act of order to a peopled kingdom. They have a king and officers of sorts, where some like magistrates correct at home, others like merchants venture trade abroad. Others like soldiers, armed in their stings, make boot upon the summer's velvet buds, which pillage they with merry march bring home to the tent royal of their emperor, who, busied in his majesty, surveys the singing masons building roofs of gold, the civil citizens kneading up the honey, the poor mechanic porters crowding in their heavy burdens at his narrow gate, the sad-eyed justice with his surly hum, delivering o'er to executors pale the lazy yawning drone. I this infer, that many things, having full reference to one consent, may work contrariously, as many arrows lucid several ways come to one mark, as many ways meet in one town, as many fresh streams meet in one salt sea, as many lines close in the dial's center, so may 1,000 actions once afoot end in one purpose and be all well born without defeat. Therefore to France, my liege.
Beautiful. All right, the obvious conclusion is war of that. So Stephen, that sounds great to me, right? It's organic, it's organized, it's peaceful and productive. But what is the bishop up to in this speech? Should we trust his story, do you think?
Well, not on your life, Michael. Certainly not. I wouldn't get on your armor and rush to France quite yet. The Archbishop of Canterbury is offering the king and the audience a vision of a well-ordered state. A state as a hive, a place where everyone is born into its particular role, stays in it, obediently carrying out the appropriate duties under the rule of the king bee. I noticed Isa's laugh when she invoked the king. The notion of the queen bee wasn't clarified, I think, until 1609, after the play was written. The prelate's purpose is to reassure the king that invading France is going to be a great thing. It's not going to leave the nation dangerously vulnerable, because all the little bees are going to do their various tasks and the hive will remain strong and secure. But Shakespeare carefully precedes this marvelous speech, and I hadn't really taken in before how beautiful the speech is. So Isa read it so wonderfully. He precedes this speech with a little scene in which the same Archbishop of Canterbury is plotting with a fellow bishop about how to prevent a heavy tax that the House of Commons wishes to levy on the church. So the tactic they settle on is to offer the church's support for the king's proposed invasion of France. The king is very keen on doing that. And this is precisely what you then see happening. In short, you would have to be an idiot to trust the story of the happy hive.
It's sometimes said, Stephen, to stay with you, it's sometimes said that the history plays of Shakespeare are telling the story of his nation, the so-called Tudor myth. performing the act of imagination that Jill refers to. Do you think that's what he's up to, Shakespeare?
Yes. I mean, Shakespeare does tell the story of his nation, but it's an exercise of civic intelligence, not a piece of Tudor political propaganda, as it's sometimes taken to be. That's to say, Shakespeare's plays are working to fashion a community, a national community, in fact, in the case of how they must have functioned initially. But it's a community that's able to think critically and skeptically about the nation state and about the enterprise that it's part of. And that's the highest form of patriotism, not the patriotism that's about jingoistic attacks on neighboring countries.
Great. And Jill, how do you see that stories and storytelling make nations? Do they create ourselves as groups, or how does it work, do you think?
Yeah, I love the peopled kingdom here. You know, the idea that there is a place with a ruler and people under him, and that's the definition of the nation. The idea of the nation, of course, is undergoing a great transformation in this era, as you know, kind of the nation state emerges, which is, you know, the idea of a people kind of stitched together to the idea of the government, and those two things kind of mesh together awkwardly in this era. But the way that seam is made is through the telling of an origin story about the nation and the state, and somehow they have to have a shared past, those two entities. So there's something kind of magnificent about this little miniature, you know, origin story of a nation with its structure. I'm kind of fascinated to think, though, how little the framers of the Constitution read Shakespeare this way. You know, Adams and Jefferson went on a Shakespearean tour of London in 1786, the year before the Constitutional Convention. They were huge Shakespeare readers. They went to all the plays. They had their favorites, but they were never the history plays. They didn't read Shakespeare for history. They read Shakespeare for that reflection on human nature. And Madison, just to circle back to Federalist 51, was really not a Shakespeare reader at all, but he made a study of the history of nations with a particular study of the history of the fate of every republic, and in advance of the Constitutional Convention. And he made a list of the vices that befell republics. And in the end, the final vice was always for him, the people themselves. So much about the way to think about the design of the covenant, the Constitution of Rules, was about the regulation of the people. But with regard to the invention of the people and who is in the hive and what the hive even is, I just want to note a kind of grisly biographical detail about Madison that I think is somewhat apt here, partly because it's so Shakespearean, but Madison's grandfather was poisoned and killed by two people that he held as slaves. It was a story that haunted Madison his life, and it is a part of how he thought about who are people and who are not people, and how that act of constituting came to be at the founding of this vision of what a government is. I just think we would kind of do well to bear that in mind as we think about that question of the imagination of a nation.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, you point to some of the dangers of storytelling as well as the importance and their ability to shape and inspire people as well. Isa, what are your thoughts on this idea of a national story? You know, what American stories strike you that you've heard as true and positive and nourishing, and which ones strike you as false and dangerous?
Right. Well, I get scared anytime a title has like American in front of it, American something. I'm like, oh, I'm terrified. But this is actually really fun. It's taking me back to my Harvard days when I declared myself a philosophy major. It's fun to be thinking this way. I feel like, you know, we've been talking a lot recently about stories which are helpful and which hurt us. And I was really glad to hear what Jill said about Madison, and just thinking about the context historically of the making of the Constitution, and that it's in some ways contemporaneous. Well, not true. That 1609 and 1619 is like slightly contemporaneous with Shakespeare, just thinking about all those things happening at once. But I want to just kind of point out the Iroquois Confederacy, now the Haudenosaunee, that had a huge impact on the creating of the Constitution. And I feel like when we're thinking about nations, it's sort of like, which nation are we referring to? When we're saying a national story, we're talking about tribal nations. You mentioned the Lenape. Are we talking about a nation of original inhabitants or a nation of immigrants of all colors, a nation of descendants of slaves? And I think a lot about Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Project, who spoke of how the South lost the Civil War, but they won the narrative. And I think that evidence of that is how Confederate flags are now flown on houses in upstate New York after the last 4 years of an encouragement of white nationalism and supremacy. But back to what Stephen was saying, I really love the idea of a radical patriotism that doesn't receive a story of the United States as it's fed to us, but recognizes that each story can be a dream or a nightmare, depending on who's telling it and who's listening, and that our challenge as artists is to keep coming up with new narratives. Yeah,
no, and I think for me as a Shakespeare lover and artist, there is in Shakespeare the sort of an insistence on the multifaceted nature of any story. That is that seen from different angles and from different perspectives, it becomes a different story. And the way that narratives are constructed by characters and by groups of people, and have a sort of agendas and purposes, and also open-endedness. That's the final thing for me, is that the narratives in Shakespeare, some of their very open-endedness at the end of it, become, I think, invitations for participation and a kind of comment on the unfinished business of what it is we're all doing here.
yeah.
Great. So we're going to read a second passage now from a play called Henry VI, Part 2, which is the three parts of Henry VI are very early Shakespeare. But Stephen, maybe you can help set up this reading for us.
Sure. I'm sure everyone has Henry VI Part 2 in their mind anyway. Shakespeare reflected throughout his career, from the beginning really to the end, about how people fall into the hands of catastrophic leaders, and how a whole society that had seemed reasonably healthy can descend into civil war. So in this early set of history plays, which focus on the War of the Roses, he depicts the rise of a loudmouth demagogue named Jack Cade. Cade was an actual person who led a popular revolt that flared up in the 1450s and was quickly and violently suppressed. So about a century and a half before Shakespeare wrote. So in the scene that you're going to see, you see that Shakespeare is fascinated by the way that the crowd is excited by the demagogue's grotesque lies and absurd promises. There's a kind of wild, festive comedy to it all. But then the comedy turns murderous when the mob gets its hands on one of the people that Cade has targeted as an enemy, Lord Say. And after the scene that you're going to see, Lord Say is killed by the crowd. People can get killed by this kind of crazy, wild talk, as Shakespeare very well understood.
Great. So the scene is going to be read by Isa Davis again, and by our friend Michael Braun, who's with us tonight too. So let's hear Henry VI, Part 2.
Be brave, then, for your captain is brave, and vows reformation. There shall be in England 7 halfpenny loaves sold for a penny.
Yay!
The 3-hooped pot shall have 10 hoops, and I will make it felony to drink small beer.
All right.
All the realm shall be in common, and in Cheapside shall my palfrey go to grass. And when I am king, as king I will be.
God save your majesty.
I thank you, good people. There shall be no money. All shall eat and drink on my score,
Yeah.
and I will apparel them all in one livery, that they may agree like brothers and worship me, their Lord.
Well, first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers.
Nay, that I mean to do. Burn all the records of the realm. My mouth shall be the Parliament of England, and henceforward all things shall be in common.
Hello! My lord, a prize, a prize. Here's the Lord say, he that made us pay 1 in 20 15s and 1 shilling to the pound the last subsidy.
Well, he shall be beheaded for it 10 times. Ah, thou say, thou surge, nay, thou buckram lord, now art thou within point blank of our jurisdiction regal. What canst thou answer to my majesty? Be it known unto thee by these presents, even the presence of Lord Mortimer, that I am the broom that must sweep the court clean of such filth as thou art. Thou hast most traitorously corrupted the youth of the realm in erecting a grammar school. And whereas before our forefathers had no other books but the score and the tally, thou hast caused printing to be used, and contrary to the king, his crown and dignity, thou hast built a paper mill. It will be proved to thy face that thou hast men about thee that usually talk of a noun and a verb, and such abominable words as no Christian ear can endure to hear.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. So, Stephen, talk about why you wanted to bring that scene into this conversation.
Well, there are many things to say, but one is that the first thing we do besides killing the lawyers is to attack education. To put someone in charge of the education department, as it were, who will take it all apart and do as much damage as possible, is what Shakespeare sees as the attack on the law, on the basic observance of the law, and on contracts and obligations, but also on education, as the way in which demagogues act. And the source of the power here is the crowd's fantasy of abrogating all the rules, of overturning the laws, of canceling the debts, and the tremendous resentment, which it actually is in many ways justified resentment on the part of the mob toward the educated elite. Because the mob, this mob in Shakespeare's world, is actually not being represented, they feel, by anyone in power, and they're probably right. And they can be manipulated quite easily, at least as Shakespeare understands it, to express their rage in the way that they do in this scene.
Yeah, and Jill, I mean, the founding fathers had similar concerns about the people, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we hear a lot today about how we have an anti-democratic constitution. You hear that from progressives all the time, and in many ways, indeed, we do. And it's because of this fear of the multitude and their gullibility to demagoguery. The people in this scene are completely duped by this guy. And that very much is, when we hear in Madison's Federalist 51 that ambition needs to be checked, it can't be checked by the people. There has to be a structural check to the ambition of the man who is the demagogue here. But I think what it doesn't show us is a countervailing view, which is that dignity is actually in the people. That's not what Shakespeare is showing here, but that is actually what we believe, right? I mean, I believe that. I mean, I do actually believe in the people, and I believe in the sovereignty of the people. And that is an idea. Edmund Morgan, the great Yale historian, always called that the big make-believe, that there is such a thing as the people. The people are really an invention of the English Revolution, just a few decades after Shakespeare's death, when Morgan wrote this great book called Inventing the People. But when James I asserted the divine right of kings and as the source of his sovereignty as the monarch, Parliament said, no, well, we're sovereign because we represent the people. We did that in a time immemorial. The people said, you can represent us. And the royalists said, but like, what day did that happen? And who are those people? Because who are the people are different. People die every day. There is no the people. What are you even talking about? And that's why the Levelers in 1647 write this document called the Agreement of the People, which they have this idea that every free Englishman will sign and say, in fact, yes, we are the people and we have asked Parliament to represent us, and therefore Parliament has power over the king because we are finally sovereign. But that incredibly tense debate is itself a kind of manipulation of the people. It's the invocation of the people. So I think the question for us that remains a heated question, is how do we understand who the people are today? What is that we the people? What do we do with it? It's clearly in an incredibly fragile state of unraveling, given the aftermath of this election. But you can see the scourge of what the consequences of inventing the people, and also failing to see or to concede a possibility of the dignity of the people in this, brilliantly funny indictment of the people.
Yeah, Isa, do you sounds like some of the things you were talking about before? That is who are the people? That is.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, I love, again, the concept that, the people just keeps getting broader and broader and broader, that we just keep realizing, that person hasn't been considered a human yet, or at least, a full, like not a fractional human, but a full human, and that's who ends up being represented, in the Constitution and in our government. But if I might, can I just talk a little about this printing thing? I was so struck by that, and how printing and information, and that being a danger, and I think about just new technologies in general and how they're always a threat, they're always a big disruption. And I just wonder, and maybe Jill and Stephen could speak to this at some point, about the moment of printing presses and books actually, becoming a readily available form of technology, and how the solitary act of reading, rather than the communal sitting around a fire or pub and telling stories through that oral tradition, just, must have completely changed things in I think a similar way as, what the internet and social media has kind of been doing to us right now, in that it's providing all of this information and also pulling us further and further apart from one another. So yes, that was just something that I kind of just wanted to throw out there as a topic, because I just think our democracy clearly, and the nature of conversation and of attention, and our very neurology and patience and all of these things are at stake right now. And I just wonder about this moment of printing presses and books being available, if that was sort of a parallel moment. So.
Yeah, well, Jill, you've written a lot about the importance of printed documents and to the American democracy, right? Do you have thoughts about the importance of print?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really interesting point. I would say, just as a general rule of thumb, that a new technology of communications always upends the political order. And then there's a kind of period of disequilibrium, but it is generally followed by a period of equilibrium, right? So a new technology of communication that makes knowledge more readily and more quickly available to more people has a democratizing effect. And elites sort of say, well, what do we do? How do we wrest control back? And then they wrest control back, right? So shutting down the printing presses, closing the grammar school, right? Whatever is necessary to do to ensure that the people can't really be the ones to take advantage of the new technology.
Great. Stephen, I thought we might take a brief detour into the Roman plays of Shakespeare, because as you just say on this one point, that is the representation of the people, the representation of the mob is throughout Coriolanus and Julius Caesar in particular. Do we think that Shakespeare was anti-democratic?
Look, Michael, Shakespeare was a world expert at the manipulation of crowds. And he didn't think that the people, oppressed, beleaguered, frightened, lied to, excited, would always follow the right course of action or choose the right leaders. Jill has already spoken of that in relation to Madison. So in Richard III, he depicts monstrous Richard coming to power through a popular election. In Julius Caesar, he shows the mob aroused by Antony's cunning speech into a frenzy of violence. As we saw in the Jack Cades scene, this demagogue manages to get the people to attack the only thing that might actually save them, which is something like to have access to education. But it doesn't mean he's anti-democracy. It means that he believed people needed to be awakened and alert. And everything about his plays are about being alert. Wake up and listen and watch and see what's going on and see how you're being manipulated. So I think of Shakespeare, putting aside what Shakespeare's politics would have been, who he would have voted for or not, he didn't have that occasion. I think Shakespeare is a force for democracy by virtue of awakening.
And do you think with a particular emphasis on the awakening of the individual as opposed to the crowd, or?
No, actually toward the end of his life, and you've invoked Coriolanus, I think Coriolanus is a play in which the people have far more dignity. To think of Jill's account, I mean, it's as if Shakespeare transformed his view. They're also beleaguered and manipulable in Coriolanus, but in Coriolanus, and that's been the title, of course, of tonight's event, what is the city but the people? The people speak in Coriolanus. They speak out and insist on their voice and begin to understand, awaken in the course of the play to the fact that they have voices and that they have the right to withhold their voices to people who are not meaning well for them. And I think that's actually, these are all achievements, even Shakespeare's achievements in the large context of our huge societies are small achievements. But it's a significant thing on Shakespeare's part to have worked from Henry VI, Part 2 to Coriolanus, and to see that we could actually imagine a people who could become awakened and alert to their own rights.
Great. We're going to go to our third part and our third piece of Shakespeare by reading a piece from The Tempest. It was written in 1610, I think we believe. The Tempest is the only Shakespeare play, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, to mention the Western Hemisphere, then known to England as the New World, when Ariel recalls a visit to the, quote, still vexed Bermudas. Jill, can you tell us what accounts Shakespeare may have read, and Stephen, you have stuff on this too, have read to inspire this phrase, the still vexed Bermudas?
Well, I don't think it has any specificity to it. It's a notional place in that new world. I mean, he may well have read or heard an account of the wreck of a ship called the Sea Venture in 1609. Stephen would know more about that. But it is the broad invocation of the danger and of the islands of the New World.
Just as a small footnote to this, I think he did know the Strachey account. Some of the people who invested in the theater were the same people who invested in the Virginia company. And most particularly in this case, and it's interesting in relation to tonight and in relation to Jill's work in particular, what happened when there was a shipwreck in Bermuda, which was uninhabited at that point, there was no indigenous population in Bermuda, was that the company which found itself shipwrecked in Bermuda thought, Bermuda is actually quite attractive. And the idea that they should try to get themselves organized and go on to Jamestown seemed a horrible idea to especially the lower class people on in the voyage. And so they refused. And the question was how to control this group. They wanted to have their own, they wanted to invent their own world. And it culminated in someone named Henry Payne saying to the commander of the voyage, "Kiss my etc." It's reported in Krejci, "Kiss my etc." And Henry Payne was hanged. And then they built a new ship and got to Jamestown, which was miserable and unhappy and so forth and so on. But there was a moment in which they thought, let's invent a constitution, as it were, in Jill's sense, for ourselves. Let's live in Bermuda. And that's the situation that Shakespeare is also imagining, but with it in an indigenous person in his island. What happens when people come to an island and can invent their lives?
Can you talk a little bit before we hear this passage from The Tempest about Michel de Montaigne and how he figures in Shakespeare's thinking as in general and also in this play?
I mean, we know Montaigne, and Shakespeare knew Montaigne as the creator of that fabulous mix of philosophical ruminations and personal anecdotes and moral reflections, the essays. Shakespeare almost could have read them in French. He had French, but he certainly read them in the translation done by a contemporary of his, John Florio. And you can see Montaigne's fingerprints all over the latter part of Shakespeare's career, in Hamlet and in King Lear. So he was clearly influenced by Montaigne. And they shared a lot of qualities of curiosity and skepticism, a distaste for ideological extremes, a loathing of cruelty, a fascination with the contradictions of human life. But they also had significant differences of view. And what you're going to see is a character, Gonzalo, in effect, quoting a passage from a famous essay by Montaigne of the cannibals. Gonzalo is an honest old counselor who's been shipwrecked along with other not so nice people on this mysterious desert island, where unbeknownst to him, Duke Prospero and his daughter had been shipwrecked after being driven out years earlier. And so in this scene, Gonzalo is having that moment, that Bermuda moment, in which he's imagining what kind of society, if he were in charge of it, he would create on the island if he were going to populate it. And in doing this imaginary commonwealth, he's virtually quoting from Montaigne's essay of the cannibals. Montaigne came up with his notion Montaigne interviewed a Brazilian native through an interpreter that had been brought to France, a Tupinamba Indian that had been brought back by a cannibal, brought back. And of course, Shakespeare's play has a cannibal called Caliban in it. So Montaigne drew a picture of a society that was organized on principles completely different from the principles of Europe. And that's what you're about to see. It's a fantastic moment.
Great. Well, it's a passage that's early in the play. Gonzalo is with the King of Naples, as well as the usurping Duke of Milan, who's Prospero's brother, who has ejected his brother. So Isa will read Gonzalo, who's the kindly counselor and friend of Prospero's, and Michael will read both the voices of Antonio, the usurping brother, and Sebastian, the would-be usurping brother of the king in this passage.
It is foul weather in us all, good sir, when you are cloudy.
Foul.
Had I plantation of this isle, my lord, and were the king on it, what would I do?
'Scape being drunk for want of wine.
In the commonwealth, I would by contraries execute all things. For no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate, letters should not be known, riches, poverty, and use of service, none. Contract, succession, born, bound of land, tilth, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, or wine, or oil, no occupation. All men idle, all, and women too, but innocent and pure. No sovereignty.
Yet he would be king on't. The latter end of his Commonwealth forgets the beginning.
All things in common nature should produce without sweat or endeavor. Treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine would I not have. But nature should bring forth of its own kind all poison, all abundance, to feed my innocent people.
No marrying among his subjects. None, man, all idle, whores and knaves.
I would with such perfection govern, sir, to excel the golden age.
Save his majesty. Long live Gonzalo.
Great. Again, it's like the Bishop of Carlisle in Henry V. I think we have to be alert to who the speakers are and who the listeners. It seems significant and complicated that Gonzalo, who's arguably the kindest and most generous person in the play, on the one hand, is speaking this fairy tale, is it? This vision of a different kind of organization. And the listeners and the cynical commentators are the would-be regicides, Antonio and Sebastian. It's arguably a comic passage, but I don't know, I see a new horizon coming into view. And it shares also that a phrase from the rabble, from Jack Cade in Henry VI, which is all things in common. That idea of some sort of equality of desert seems significant to me. Do we hear critiques of Western values in these languages? Anyone?
I mean, I think it is an indictment in a way that utopian visions are always indictments of the way things actually are. It's utopian, and it's mocked for being utopian. And I think Shakespeare thought that Montaigne, I think Shakespeare is the son of a glover from a provincial town, thought that the Sieur de Montaigne was out of touch with reality, though he admired him. But the mocking notwithstanding, I think this is a beginning of an attempt to rethink the way things are.
Yeah. I hear that riches, poverty, and use of service, none. And, I'm still struck by the thought of the Virginia Company just staying on Bermuda. Like, wow, what a completely different history we would have had, right? So what I'm hearing in this is how Montaigne influences Marx. Like, that's what I'm hearing in this, is like that kind of utopia that Marx was criticizing, but also creating, writing about in the early philosophical writings and manifesto. So that's what I hear in it.
I think it sounds slightly different to me, Michael, than, a kind of turn toward some new understanding of how human societies might be constituted, in that it's a replication of what has, been long established, since Vespucci, as Stephen has written about, the sort of using an imagined version of a kind of Garden of Eden that is to be found in the Western Hemisphere, where the people have no property and they have no laws and they have no religion and they have no language, they have no ideas, and they live in this beautiful state of nature that is to be admired, but is also functions as a justification for taking their land. Because if they have no concept of property, then they can't own the property. So it doesn't so much anticipate Marx as justify the taking possession of land. It does, but there is also, it has that two-sidedness, because there is also that utopianism in it. And so much of this vision, which is just a false conception, as is cannibalism, right? Which is Montaigne's point of this variety of peoples that live in the Americas. They do have a notion of property. It's not the same notion; it's a different notion. But so much of that experience of the observation and the receipt of accounts of this Edenic place animates a new way of thinking, especially in 17th century England, about a political order, because it becomes so useful to have available to you for a thought experiment. What would it be like to go to an island where where you are the first people and you get to make the laws? We wouldn't write Moses's commandments. These commandments wouldn't come down from Moses. What body of laws would we erect that emerge out of our bodies? And that's really just unbelievably fruitful for people thinking about what's going on in 17th century England with regard to who rules over who.
And I think you wanted to talk about the other famous voyage to Virginia that ended up in Massachusetts, on the Mayflower.
Yeah, I just thought it would be fun to thinking about, this 1610 play about a Commonwealth, to listen to the Mayflower Compact, which was written in 1620 by the religious separatists who ended up founding Plymouth Colony.
And just to say a little bit about why.
So they were much affected, as everyone was, by the idea that if you could go far enough away, you could build your own society and you could establish your own rules. The rules that they wanted to make had to do with perfecting the English Commonwealth as a system of government, but in particular with shedding the corruption, the political corruption and the religious corruption in England. So kind of, to begin the world anew, as what Thomas Paine would say the revolution was about, a century and a half later, was what they thought they were doing in 1690. And so they may undertake this quite literal act of constituting themselves through a written document.
And the they of that is not just the Pilgrims and Puritans, right? But the strangers, right? The non-religious passengers, right? It's all of them.
Everybody who has come can be in the covenant.
Great. Right. Well, let's hear it. This is the Mayflower Compact.
Having undertaken for the glory of God an advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, we do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves in the civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience.
Great. So Jill, what's the radical element of that speech? I mean, of that document.
Yeah, I think it is the act of writing it down in some ways, right? It's not. It is instantiating your community through a covenant that is the kind of realization of so many of these ideas that we've been, kind of bandying about, thinking about what Shakespeare was wrestling with. And I guess I just want to kind of mark out the distance between this and what we started with Federalist 51, which is written, well more than a century and a half later. Madison believes that the unruliness of the people can be checked by a proper machinery of government. That if we have these checks and balances and a perfectly honed instrument of laws, we can check that unruliness. That's not what the Pilgrims are doing here at all, right? They're checking their unruliness with their covenant with God, right? So they do see themselves as they will be thwarted and damned by their own ambition, but the check against that is their submission to God together as a single body. So what becomes really interesting historically to me is kind of how we get from there to 1787. And in a way, The Tempest is a lot closer to 1787 than the Mayflower Compact is. That's what I think is so fascinating, the kind of sophistication of Shakespeare's vision of, well, what could a community actually be? That isn't about the orthodoxy of these Protestant separatists. Stephen, do you agree with that?
I do, actually. I was thinking what's both painful and beautiful about The Tempest is that it's in touch with what you described, Jill. Where do radical ideas come from? The Tempest is a play that depicts the enslavement of the indigenous native on the island. And Montaigne's essay on the cannibals bears very little relation to the Tupinamba, who were actually exterminated by the French. So it's a tragic story, an unbearable story. But Shakespeare went out of his way at the end of The Tempest to convey a note of hope, with the old generation trying to understand where it went wrong, and with a new generation somehow prepared to try something new. And he signals how radically new it could be in that brief moment of Gonzalo's absurd utopia. Where do radical ideas come from? They come from tragic experience. They come from being this very event tonight began with, Michael, your very moving invocation of the people who lived on the land that I'm living on now, and of their fate. So we can't wipe it away. We can't pretend it didn't happen. But it's a tragic story, but it's a story that is intertwined in a way that Shakespeare really understood, with whatever hope we can extract from the catastrophes that we ourselves have been involved in. It's a deep feeling.
Mm-hmm. Isa, anything? Or Michael?
No, I'm just struck over and over again by how I feel this contradiction. You know, it's what Stephen was talking about. You know, that I really, when taught about the framers and about the checks and balances, and you know, I mean, I think I really believed, of all of the three, you know, branches of government, I really believed in the Supreme Court. That was like my thing. And I'm just thinking about, you know, these dreams and then these realities that we live, and how, you know, they just continue to rub against one another, and that they learn from each other in, again, very painful, very catastrophic ways. But so yes, I'm just literally feeling the contradiction in my own body right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Jill, do you know whether the Pilgrims had made contact with the indigenous people by the time they wrote the compact, or does this happen before that? Do we know?
I think it was written on board ship. Recall, though, that there had been a terrible, devastating smallpox epidemic in the southern coast of New England between 1616 and 1619 that nearly wiped out the population. So that it had to do with Indians who had an extensive network of trade all the way up through the Great Lakes and into New France. So contagion of what was for them, you know, a pandemic had spread well before any English arrived. So that when the Pilgrims, so-called, set foot, they found that the land had been cleared for them by God, right? So that becomes a huge part of the self-conception of the first settlers of New England, that there had been a divine intervention. They can tell that there are villages, towns that are just empty. There are piles of bones. They discover piles and piles and piles of bones. And this, since their view of history was entirely providential, is a sign from God.
Great. Well, it's about 8:15, so we're going to take. There are a couple of questions here in the my little thing here. I thought we might start with an easy one from Karen. So, do you think that Trump read Shakespeare?
I think that it's unlikely, but I do think that we should uh, give a nod to Donald Trump for doing his best to make Shakespeare great again. Shakespeare has never seemed more present to me. In fact, Henry VI, Part 2 came alive when I saw the crowd in Opelika, Florida, chanting "Fire Fauci, Fire Fauci." I thought I was watching that scene, and Donald Trump said, "Thank you, my good people," exactly in the manner of Jack Cade. So I'm, to that extent, I'm grateful.
Great.
Can I just add, as someone
Sure.
who was in the Julius Caesar production
Oh, right.
at the Delacorte in 2017, which was disrupted constantly by Trump supporters, and that actually, I guess it was Donald Trump Jr. Said that we were responsible for the shooting that happened in the snipers that were in Virginia, I believe. Is that where there was the congressional softball game? And they
Right.
blamed our production of Julius Caesar. So I think the answer to, did Trump read Shakespeare, and maybe did his supporters read Shakespeare? I think the answer is they read the headline, but not the whole play, because obviously what they were protesting in the play was that Caesar was dressed up to be Trump, and we all assassinated him in the play. But of course, what happens if you read the play is you understand that those who live by the sword die by the sword, and everyone who assassinates Caesar dies by the end. So I think I think the answer is that have a little critical faculty and read through to the end.
Great. Kevin asks, so how does democracy allow for an evolutionary remix of diverse perspectives as we might hope for in living theater? Is democracy due for its own evolution into a different form of governance that better allows for these goals? And is it due now? Anyone?
I can jump in here just to kind of go back to something that Isha said that I thought was so beautiful at the very beginning about the experience of theater. If you think about democracy, it asks three things. Representation, that is, you have to be willing to have your views represented by other people. Participation, you have to vote and be willing to run for office if called to, and deliberation. And deliberation is a communal experience, not unlike the experience of being in a theater, right? You're presented with something, but you often, there will be an after show which involves essentially a deliberation. That feature of democracy, that means that we sit together in a room and talk to one another, is the piece that has really fallen out and that seems so untenable, not least during the pandemic, of course, but long before the pandemic. Deliberation was the thing we had stopped doing. And a fully functioning heterogeneous population that wants to live in a democracy has to be willing to sit in rooms together, which is, one of the things that's beautiful about even the horror that is the Zoom room, which is still better than nothing, is this act of coming together and deliberating. What do we believe? What do we disagree about? What can we agree about? What does it mean to really listen to one another? And I think so much of that is a set of things that we learn by coming together in a theater.
Great. A question from Anne. Stephen, following up on what you said about education in Henry VI, in Coriolanus, it seems that Shakespeare explores how the sausage gets made in real politics. He seems characteristically ambivalent about the people versus other people who might actually know something or be educated in a way that offers a solution to the people that might not have occurred to the people. Can you comment?
It's a very interesting remark. And I think that in my view, but as we've already said, these plays are very ambiguous and they can be read in multiple ways. In my view, Shakespeare, surprisingly, in Coriolanus, imagined that the people would be saved by very ordinary, rather hard-bitten politicians, not by grand figures, great philosophers or profound leaders, but by, they're called Brutus and Sicinius. They're two tribunes who are actually down in the trenches, as it were, of ordinary political life, of retail politics. And it's they who managed to organize the people to vote in a sane way. So I took that play, even absolutely agree that with lots of the play has lots of skepticism about the intelligence and canniness of the people. I took that play to be a remarkable thinking through of what it would take to have real political life with actual political leaders who are in touch with the voters and speak to them and try to explain to them who is trying to hurt them and who is trying to help them. They're not hugely admirable, but they're impressive in a way that, well, I won't name names, certain people who aren't so marvelous, but actually make the phone calls, run the registering of voters, and actually get something to happen that is ultimately to saves the state in that play.
This is just a nice comment from Anonymous, but it raises the topic of Shakespeare's empathy. It's as though Shakespeare's empathy, commitment to subjectivity and imagination during a time of monarchy and hierarchy were seeds for a flawed and halfway liberal democracy across the ocean, conceived by people who couldn't quite embrace the dignity and possibility of people and the people in the way he did. But here he is still being read aloud over Zoom in 2020, helping us create new cracks in our order. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. But do we think that there's a step forward, there's progress, and I sense it in Shakespeare and in Montaigne, that is towards the dignity of the individual? Is that a value in Shakespeare? Anyone?
I want to say that Isha should answer this question because it's about what we make of him now. It's not about, ultimately, it's not about what was in him, though I think there was plenty of that in him, but it's what's available now for to make of him or anyone else that we receive from our tainted past.
So we'll talk about well, respond to that, but also talk maybe about the role of empathy in the work of a playwright.
Well, I'm thinking about the concepts Jill speaks of with how the contesting of what the story is the actual story, right? The competing stories we keep talking about, and writing all of them down as a Shakespeare would do, as a contemporary playwright does. And that there's something about the kind of conflict, basically, that is, I think, the way to model ourselves forward. You know, is the conflict always going to be a bloody one, which of course is the easiest thing for us to use, which of course was all over Shakespeare, right? But are there forms of conflict now that we can actually turn to as healthy conflicts models, you know? And that comes up in some of the work that I've been up to recently, just really trying to see how models and forms of restorative justice can actually work in a theatrical context. And I guess I also just want to keep thinking about storytelling itself, and how they're going back to what I said about making new narratives, that writing informs, and I think Shakespeare actually is a great model of this, that you can see all of the various kinds of forms that he wrote in play after play. And, you know, some are just entirely jumbled. And of course, we see it now in context as something quite artful, or again, as Stephen was pointing out, something that happened along the way as the play evolved, through its different iterations. But I really love the idea of thinking about storytelling and order as something that continues to throw us forward onto the edges of our seats and onto the tips of our toes as performers, that we don't necessarily expect what will come next. We don't know what will happen in the narrative, that there isn't a formula that we can lean on. And I think that's what Shakespeare was challenging in his work, clearly. And I think that's what we get to do as playwrights now.
Beautiful. Yeah, this idea of the contested stories being the story. Jill, I know that you've written a lot about in the book This America. Can you just talk about that? That is the how you see what you say. The sort of, for me, it's related to the idea of deliberation and conversations. But how is it? How do we deal with stories at this moment? Like, how do we now have very starkly contrasting stories of what the country is right now. And is there a way, I don't know, what do we do with those competing stories? And is there a way forward to a different story, or are we framing it in the wrong way?
I just think that's an awfully hard question right now when, in the current moment, and this has been the case certainly at least since Obama's election, our notion of the nation's past just maps on perfectly to our partisan positions. And, which tells you that our understanding of the past shapes our understanding of present day problems and, the solutions that are necessary in the future. And it's very difficult for a people, an invented political community that lives in a place together to make decisions about what to do next when our notions of what happened yesterday are completely different. So I think it's a fairly urgent problem, but I also think it's a quite deep problem. I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the cost, though, of deciding that the answer is, because this has been the decision within, my field in American history for the last half century. It's just too complicated. There are too many stories. You couldn't tell one story. You'd leave too much out. It would offend someone. You'd get it wrong. The best thing to do is just recognize there's a multiplicity of stories and there can be no single story. And I intellectually am deeply sympathetic with that and have been sympathetic with it for the whole of my career until I began to notice how all the public space around a national story is taken up by villains that Shakespeare couldn't have even imagined, right? Bill O'Reilly's history books remain, I think, the best-selling books of American history in all of American history. I mean, it's extraordinary what people accept as a national story. So I think there have been, the 1619 Project is an attempt to offer a new national story, right? Trump counters with the 1776 Commission and where are we left then? It is a real problem. But I do think it's I think it's a fairly urgent matter. I mean, you can do a comparison, say, rhetorically, of the speech that Donald Trump gave July 4th weekend at Mount Rushmore, and the speech that Joseph Biden gave this fall at Gettysburg, right? And they both offered an account of American history. And their accounts of American history are utterly incommensurate. I think that's a difficult situation to be in.
Indeed. Great. Thank you, everybody. Does anyone have any final thoughts you want to share before we close out? It's been beautiful. Good. Okay, great. Jill, set us up for this final reading. We're going to say goodnight. Thank you very much to Meredith Walters and to Jakob and to BPL Presents. And thank you to the panelists and performers here tonight, Michael and Isa and Jill and Stephen. It's a real pleasure. Yeah, let's take it home. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, it's been a huge honor to be part of this conversation. It's been lovely in so many ways, and really provocative. I had just proposed that we end with the document that James Madison was defending in Federalist 51, which is which is our inheritance, and one that derives from a notion of the people that would have been entirely familiar to Shakespeare, and that participates in a sense of rhythm and language that I think is very much indebted to Shakespeare, and quite self-consciously so. And that for all the contests over what we do with these words, what they mean to us, I would propose that they remain worth listening to. So here is the preamble to the 1787 Constitution of the United States.
And thank you all so much for this conversation. And I hope you don't mind if I do, like you do at the end of a Shakespeare play, I'm gonna sing the preamble, Schoolhouse Rock style, because the music is by Lynn Ahrens, who wrote Ragtime and Once on This Island. It's very theatrical. So if you know it, please sing along. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. Down, down, down. Provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. To ourselves and our posterity do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. For the United States of America.